So here is our Python code on Python Tutor. The first thing I'm going to do is change the programming language. Although Python Tutor suggests that it's good for running Python code, you will see that it can actually work for many different languages. We are going to choose the C programming language. Now when we switch to C, this is no longer legal C code. We have to change it. So the way we write the equivalent of this if condition in C is quite different. We have to write it not inside an if condition, but inside a function called main. So we will have a function called main. That function will take no arguments. Now in C, when we write a function, we don't end the signature line with a colon and then indent the block. Instead, we write the statements inside the body of the function inside curly brackets. So we start the curly bracket over there, and then we will put the closing curly bracket over here. We have seen that in Python we say def and then the name of the function. In C, we don't say def, but we have to say what the return type of this function is. Now, a C program will start with main as its entry point, and that main function will return an integer. And that integer is going to be 0 if this program runs successfully. Now we have seen that in Python, the return type is merely a hint. In C, we have to say what the type is, and we say the type before the name of the function. So this is slightly different. So a C program is at least int main, starting with curly brackets and ending with curly brackets, and then that function should return the value 0 to indicate success. Now I'm going to write my return 0 over here. Notice that it is not properly indented with everything else. In C, it turns out that indentation does not matter. This just looks a little bit ugly. I could try and fix it by improving the indentation, and that's always a good thing to try and do. If I do Shift Tab, that will de-indent this code, and I can similarly de-indent that code and that code and that code. So this is a little bit closer to a C program, but there are still several other changes that I need to make. Line 2, for example, is saying x is this integer. I have similar syntax for assigning x to an integer, but I have to make some changes. Remember, variables in C are statically typed. So just like I said, main returns an int, I must say that x is an integer variable. So I have to say int x is equal to this number. Every statement in C, including an assignment statement, must end with a semicolon. This is not there in Python, but in C, the language has these additional syntactic elements. Now I have a print statement. It turns out that in C, you cannot print something unless you first import the print statement into your C program. So to do that, you have to write something like an import statement here. It's not called import in C, it's called include, and we write hash include. Now we have seen that in Python, the hash symbol is the start of a comment. That is not the case in C. So hash include is a little bit like import, and then we want to import a special file. If it's a special file, we put that inside angled brackets, which are really just less than and greater than. And in this particular case, the file that contains the definition of print is in something called the standard input output, or stdio.h. The .h stands for header. So there is a header file called stdio, and we are including it or importing it into this particular code. Now we can call something like the print function and print some sort of f string, except that function is not called print with an F over here, it's called printf. Now, in C, strings have to be within double quotes. So we cannot use single quotes, we will use double quotes. And we must end with a semicolon. Now remember the special meaning of these curly brackets in Python? That was together with f strings, and it said that I want to print id of x is equal to whatever the id of x is. I can't do that in C. So instead of this, I will say I want to print id of x, which is some sort of integer, and I will want to print that integer in decimal form. So the printf statement says print id of x equals to some decimal. So %d stands for some decimal. And what is that decimal? Well, that decimal is the id of x, right? Unfortunately, I don't have a function called id of x. So instead of printing id of x, I'm going to print ampersand of x, which is roughly similar to id of x. Exactly what ampersand of x is, we will take a look at in our lecture. But for now, I'm just going to print something that is roughly the same as the id of x. So the print statement looks quite different. It's called printf. You can print whatever you like as a string, but if you want to put something equivalent to inside curly brackets of a Python f string, you must tell me what type that is. I say I want to print a decimal integer, and then I will provide that integer. So hopefully this is actually going to produce an integer, and that integer will get printed here. One more little quirk: a print statement in Python automatically inserts a new line. A printf statement in C doesn't insert a new line. So you would have to write your own new line over here. So this was a non-trivial change, but fortunately we need to make exactly that same change over here, so I can simply copy paste that. The times equal to syntax is the same in C, so we will leave that statement as is, except we have to remember to put a semicolon at the end. Now when it comes to the if statement, we have to make a couple of changes. Firstly, this condition has to be within round brackets or parentheses. These are absolutely necessary. And then the statement inside the body of the if, remember in Python we have a colon and then indentation. We indicate that not with indentation in C, but again with curly brackets. So we will write curly brackets over here. Once again, this would have to be a printf, and once again we would put a semicolon at the end. So similar changes would have to be made for everything else. Elif has to be written as else if in C. Once again, this has to be in parentheses. Once again, we must use curly brackets, and once again we must call this printf. And this last else remains as is. Else is a keyword in C, and this will again be a printf. And finally we will close this curly bracket. So that's quite a few changes, but now we should have legal C code. Let's check this by clicking on Visualize Execution.